Travel is more than just ticking off countries. It's about the people, the culture, the food, the moments. I'm Pippa Hudson, and on Wonder the World, I invite you to join me every week as we explore destinations both near and far, with the help of fellow adventurers who share their unique travel stories. Listen to my podcast wherever you get them.
You're with Clement Manyathela.
7:02. Let's walk the talk.
It's 20 minutes after 10 o'clock. Okay. Let's go to Chrispin Phiri now, who is the spokesperson for the Department of International Relations. Chrispin, thank you so much for making time. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement, and good morning to our 702 listeners.
Thank you. So one of the questions I've received from listeners this morning is around the vetting process. So maybe let's start there. Have this group of Afrikaners who left and are US bound now, have they been properly vetted by the authorities?
Yes, we understand that the authorities have vetted them, because for us the interest is to ensure that we do not have fugitives of justice fleeing the country and going to another country where it would require our criminal justice system to embark on an extradition process, and we all know how convoluted and technical that can get. So it was important to ensure that the individuals who have been earmarked for this refugee program, which we believe are not refugees, are properly screened by the relevant authorities, and we have assurances that this was done, and none of the individuals are within the processes of the criminal justice system.
Okay, so that's cleared, right? And what about then their definition? Because the US seems to be insisting on defining them as refugees, but when you look at the Refugee Convention and how it defines a refugee, that's quite different, and you have to ask yourself whether this group of Afrikaners actually meet that threshold. Was this explained to the US? How did they justify their insistence on wanting to define them and label them as refugees?
Two things is that, one, of course, Afrikaans is a language. It's not an actual race group. So, and I mean, Clement, we are from a generation where we were taught Afrikaans in school, and it still continues. So the idea that people are being persecuted on the basis of a language can evidently be contested by anyone who looks at the South African system. But what we do know in terms of refugee law is, when an individual is being considered for refugee status in any country, that process is confidential between the individual seeking refugee status and that country concerned. And so there is a subjective element into it as to whether that country would regard an individual who is seeking refugee status as someone, as firstly there being a well-grounded perception of this persecution, but secondly, whether indeed this person would qualify in that country. So it's a subjective exercise to some extent. And it being of a confidential nature, probably of these 49 individuals, there is a possibility in theory that each and every one of them would have a different reason as to why they are being granted refugee status by the American authorities. But we know that they have said to us that they are granting them refugee status, and the world, through the executive order, that they are granting them refugee status on the grounds of persecution of the Afrikaner people, land dispossession that has never happened, and also citing to some extent our transformatory regime that we are trying to undo the very legacy of apartheid. So that is the criteria that they have used, and that's why we say in our statement, even if one believes that there's some form of discrimination, whether it then reaches the point of persecution is really a question that is quite obvious for everyone to interrogate.
Okay. Well, one of our listeners wanted to know if this group can come back to visit South Africa. So once they're declared as refugees in America, can they come back here for December holidays or come attend weddings or other events with that, that labeling of as refugees?
Yes, precisely. The whole idea of seeking refuge in another country is that you are being persecuted in your country of origin. The minute you go back to your country of origin, you then refute or revoke your refugee status in the country that has sheltered you from persecution. So that is how refugee law works. these individuals may of their own come back to South Africa. It's called self-deportation if they wish to come back to South Africa, and they may come back. But in terms of international law and the principle of non-refoulement, they cannot be sent back by the state. So let's say, for instance, hypothetically speaking, Jan van Niekerk does something wrong in the United States and they determine that actually he's a refugee from South Africa, he cannot be deported because that's the principle of non-refoulement. But if our hypothetical Jan van Niekerk decides to come back to South Africa, they're most welcome to come back because you have a right of return as a citizen. But the implication is that in the country where you now seek refuge, you would no longer be accepted back because you clearly are not being persecuted in your country of origin.
Okay, so but in a nutshell, once you are declared a refugee there because you are seen as you have fled, it would make sense for you then to go back to the same country that you fled because of persecution.
Yes, that's the nutshell. So yeah, you really can't have your cake and eat it. So you can't go to the U.S. on migration interest and economic interest, be granted refugee status, and then suddenly decide I missed South African weather in December. I'd like to have a braai with my kids in Pretoria and come back. No, it doesn't work like that. That's something that you have to forgo. But also to say this, because you are a refugee in country X, you then also do not have access to the diplomatic services of your country of origin. If you choose to engage with the diplomatic services of your country of origin, then you also run the risk of revoking your refugee status in that country.
Okay. And then Alfaza says, what happens to their citizenship? Because they are there based on an incorrect labeling, are they then regarded as persona non grata?
In terms of the South African Constitution, Section 20, you cannot deprive someone of their citizenship. So deprivation, there's something that we cannot do in terms of the Constitution. But I think, as all things litigation, maybe this is something that can be clarified further down the line by our courts. I think our Constitution would not have envisioned this type of a scenario. So, but the general principle in terms of our Constitution is that we cannot deprive a citizen of their citizenship.
Oh, okay. And then another question someone else has is, what happens when they arrive in the U.S.? So based on the U.S.'s definition of refugee, when they are resettling people who have quote-unquote fled persecution, what happens when they arrive in the U.S.? Are they given housing? Are they taken to they don't have camps there in the U.S., but what's the setup? Where do they go? Are they being taken to hotels? What can they do? What can't they do? Are they given citizenship? What can you share with us?
That's a question for the U.S. authorities because each country has its own way of handling asylum seekers and refugees. And ordinarily, Clement, at least let's say in the real refugee context, these are individuals that are not fetched from a particular country. They would rock up on your doorstep and say, I'm fleeing persecution from country X, please assist me. And then that country would then process their refugee status, having understood that this person is literally fleeing. But these individuals have been fetched. So it remains to be seen and probably explained to interested parties by the American authorities how they would process this. And it's not something that our government would be privy to because it falls within the realm of their own domestic law. But also, like I said earlier, because of the confidential nature of a refugee application, it would vary from individual to individual.
Okay. Chrispin, thank you so much for that. Chrispin Phiri is a spokesperson at DIRCO. I thought we should bring him up so that he can respond to some of the questions some of you had on the 702 open line this morning. So I hope you've got some clarification about what the process is. Clearly, South Africa and the U.S. government disagree on what the reasons are for this group being resettled. But nevertheless, as Chrispin says, it can be a subjective process. So that's how they define a refugee. They're going to resettle these Afrikaners, and we'll have more information probably by tomorrow. Where have they been taken, and how they're going to be set up for them to continue with their lives there in America. So we'll keep giving you updates on this story if that's what you really care about.